It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting either through my website, emailrevealer.com, and just reach me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Today we have Dan Lawton. He's an attorney. He's written a book called Above the Ground, a true story of the troubles in Northern Ireland. You can find his book at Above the Ground, abovethegroundbook.com. You can find him on Twitter at Dan Lawton Writer, Lawton. The book is available at Wild Blue Press. And if you want to meet Dan Lawton in person, Warwick's in La Jolla, September 7th, 7 p.m., and before that, they're having a little tribute, a little hair of the dog, I guess, at Hennessy's Bar at 6 p.m. before the book signing there at Warwick's in La Jolla. So, Dan Lawton, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Ed.
Hey, great. Thank you so much. Hey, before we get into your book here, Above the Ground, True Story of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, who's Dan Lawton?
Well, I'm a lawyer in San Diego and a writer. Above the Ground is my first book. I was born in Los Angeles and grew up in Orange County and went to Notre Dame undergrad and Georgetown Law School and became a lawyer practicing in San Diego. And I met Kevin Barry Artt, the subject of my book, in 1992, shortly after he was first arrested by the FBI. And we got to know each other. I did some legal work for him for a short time, pro bono on an immigration issue, and then stopped being his attorney in about the year 2000. And at some point after that, decided this is a good story that deserves telling, and wouldn't it be great if I got to do it someday? And I started working on it full time in 2018, and it culminated in the book being published just about 3 weeks ago by Wild Blue Press.
Yeah, it's funny. Of course, you would have immigration troubles after all these other problems you had in 1993. But I guess it starts way before 93. And I guess, why don't you tell the audience first, what was the Troubles in Northern Ireland?
Well, the Troubles was a 30-year-long conflict between essentially three different parties in the 6 counties of Ireland that are Northern Ireland. The three parties were the Irish Republican Army, which was a guerrilla army that was fighting to drive the British government out of Northern Ireland. The Loyalist side, which were people who lived in Northern Ireland who felt very strongly that Northern Ireland should remain part of the UK and the British presence was needed. And the British government, which for much of that time ruled Northern Ireland directly from London, and which sent in the British Army to fight the IRA. And that conflict ended in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement, which was brokered by the Clinton administration and through the help of Senator George Mitchell. And the Troubles resulted in about 3,700 people being killed, most of them civilians, a great number of injured, maybe 47,000 or so, and a lot of other human and economic costs that I think are very hard to quantify.
Oh, yeah, especially when you consider what a small geographic area Northern Ireland was. And there were just kidnappings and shootings and bombings going on, like stuff that didn't make the news for such a small geographic area.
It's about the size of Connecticut.
Right. It blows your mind. But 40,000 people, you said, Andrew, blows your mind.
Yeah.
So now Kevin Barry Artt, how did he get swept up in all of this? What was his involvement?
I would say he was kind of an accidental hero. He grew up in the Belfast area. He was born out of wedlock in a convent in 1959. He had a Protestant father and a Catholic mother. They were teenagers, and he was adopted by the sister of his mother and brought up by John and Maeve Artt. John Artt had a small gas station business, also a diner. And initially, when he was a kid, he didn't have any exposure to the troubles. He led, what could be called a suburban life, a sheltered life. But he moved out of his parents' house when he was about 15 after conflict he'd had with his mother, and he moved in with the family of a girlfriend of his named Lorraine Keenan in the New Lodge area, which was in West Belfast, and an area that was very heavily patrolled by the British Army at the time. And he started to experience firsthand the heavy hand of the police, the RUC, and the British Army. He started working, and he started experiencing and seeing a lot of discrimination and bad treatment of the local people by the RUC and the British Army. At one point, he wanted to join the IRA. He was so angry about what he saw and experienced. He wound up not joining the IRA because they didn't want him. And eventually he was swept up, arrested, as were a great number of other people, and interrogated over a murder that was very high profile, an IRA murder of a British prison official named Albert Miles. And at the time, most of the IRA prisoners were housed in a place called the Maze Prison outside Belfast, and there was a severe conflict inside the prison between IRA prisoners and their guards, the prison administration, who had started to treat them as common criminals after a period of treating them essentially like POWs under the Geneva Convention. And a series of protests by the prisoners, which culminated in the hunger strikes in which Bobby Sands died, triggered a situation in which the IRA decided to start going after prison officials on the outside, assassinating them in their homes. And Albert Miles was one of the victims of that campaign. Kevin Barry Artt was tried in a diplock court. That's a term of art for a court that operated under emergency powers, which the British government had enacted to deal with the situation in Northern Ireland. It was the longest and most expensive trial in Irish legal history. It lasted for the better part of 10 months. He and a number of the other defendants were all tried for a series of crimes that were unrelated to one another, and he was sentenced to life in prison in the Maze. And about 7 weeks later, he escaped and became the most wanted fugitive of the British government in the world. Made his way to California. So that's
let me stop you for a second. Yeah, let me stop.
Yeah.
Because now, here you're saying that the original charges is that he was accused of assassinating a prison official on the outside.
Right.
And then when he's convicted, they stick him back into the prison where they're accusing him that he had killed one of the guards there. So his welcome to that prison must have been horrific, 10 times worse than anybody's.
You're exactly right, Ed. He was welcomed to the Maze prison. He was flown there in a Chinook helicopter by the British Army and arrived. And within 5 minutes, the governor of the prison, or what we would call here the warden, said, you killed Albert Miles, and I'm going to make sure that your stay here is hell for the rest of your life. And indeed, they started doing that. There was a lot of abuse of him at that prison before he escaped.
And how old was he when he entered that prison?
Well, that was 1983, so he was 24 years of age at the time.
24 years old. Imagine that, man.
Yeah.
All right, and that prison was hell to begin with, man. If you didn't have a beef with these guys, you could just imagine going in there. Just imagine the pit of your stomach, man, walking into that joint, man, knowing what you're facing. But somehow or other, he was able to get out, escape in 7 weeks, you said?
Yes, the escape had been in the works for a number of months before he even got there.
Okay.
And there had been a number of escape attempts in the past. The British inevitably foiled the escape attempts. The IRA would try to dig a tunnel. The British had ground-penetrating radar. They were able to figure out where the tunnels were pretty easily and, of course, forced the prisoners to fill them back in. And eventually it was decided the way out is not through a tunnel. The way out is through the front gate. What if we were to hijack a food truck? There was a food truck that went around to all the different cell blocks delivering food. Each cell block was basically a self-contained prison within a prison. It had its own kitchen and commissary and classrooms and cells. And so this food truck, if they could take the guards seize them, disable them, take their weapons, and then take their uniforms, and then fill up the back of the food truck with prisoners. Maybe they could go through a series of secure gates, impersonating guards and acting as if, this was just another normal Sunday at the maze, and drive it out the front gate. That was the plan, and he learned about it on the morning that it happened. They came to him at the last minute and said, "There's an escape today. Do you want to go?" And he said yes.
Once again, 24 years old, just imagine. I'm curious now, because if he wasn't officially IRA, but he was accused of these crimes, but then the IRA did come to support him in his court trial. They provided him with legal assistance and stuff?
Well, the IRA didn't provide legal assistance to him. He had a lawyer that represented him at public expense, as all of the defendants did in that trial. But Ed, as you point out, he had a very sort of unusual status, or sort of in a gray area. He wasn't in the IRA. He was not hazed, but sort of given the cold shoulder by the IRA on the inside when he was there. They didn't approve of him. He socialized with a couple of other prisoners that were members of the INLA, which was another group that the IRA didn't like. He smoked a little hash. They were very anti-drug, so they didn't like him all that much. But he was doing life, and one of the rules of the escape was people should have a chance to go if they wanted to go, if they were lifers, and he met that description. After he got out of there, the IRA did provide support for him. They helped him move from safe house to safe house, eventually got him out of the country, and eventually put him on a plane to the United States with some cash and a contact in San Francisco. So he had a sort of a strange, I guess you would call it, relationship or status with the IRA during the time he was at the maze and after.
Gotcha, but they did assist him when he got out, because you can just imagine if you wake up and then next thing you know, you're part of a prison break today, you're on the street the next day just with no support. You wouldn't last very long. He gets into the United States, and back in 1983, you could still go underground here in the United States. You could get fake ID. You could operate underneath cash society. And when they set him up, did he have continued support, or was he shortly on his own?
He was shortly on his own. And as you say, Ed, I mean, in 1982, there weren't Ed Oppermans, if you will, with the sort of training and expertise that you have, and a lot of technology that we have today that's used by professionals like you just wasn't available. So he managed to get his hands on a birth certificate of a kid who had died, and presented that birth certificate at the DMV, managed to get a driver's license, a passport in the name of that person, that deceased kid, and create a new identity, which was that of Kevin Cohane, Keohane, and, became a used car salesman, did odd jobs, worked as a private investigator for a time like you. But he did all of that without any assistance.
Fascinating. The guy worked as a PI. You think his time at the Maze prison would have been bad enough? He would have avoided PI work. I guess not. He wasn't scarred enough, right? Okay, so now he's operating in California, underground pretty much. Did he get in any trouble? Life of any brushes with the law?
He didn't get in any trouble. I think he might have had a DUI arrest, which was busted down, I think, to a wet reckless. That would have been his one brush with the law here in California. I mean, otherwise he was peaceful, law-abiding. He wasn't political. He avoided, going to places where there were Irish people, Irish pubs, things like that. And one of the reasons he moved out of San Francisco and down to San Diego was exactly that. He knew that the FBI was in the pubs. They were looking for Maze escapees. They were looking for IRA men. And his thinking was, I am going to get as far away from all that as possible. San Diego doesn't have a very big Irish community compared to San Francisco or New York, a place like that. And so he came to San Diego.
And so the FBI was aware he was hiding out in the United States and looking for him?
The FBI knew at some point that there were Mays escapees living in the States. And there was a history during the Troubles of IRA men escaping to the U.S. because there was something then called the political offense exception under the extradition treaty between the U.K. and the U.S. And essentially it said if the person sought for extradition, if their crime of which they were convicted can be argued to have a basis in politics, like you're rebelling against the British government, the United States, the American judge could withhold the extradition and refuse it. And a number of IRA men succeeded in making that legal argument. The British had enough of that. And when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan got together, one of the first items on her agenda was getting rid of that political offense exception in the treaty. And so the treaty was rewritten, amended in 1985, and in 1986 it became the new treaty. By that time, of course, the escape had happened. And eventually the British government figured out that there must be some escapees living in California. They had fingerprints of those escapees. The DMV out here keeps a database of everyone's fingerprints who's got a driver's license. And about once a year, they started just running one set of fingerprints against the DMVs. And up came a few fingerprints, and one set of those belonged to Kevin Barry Artt, who had given his fingerprints as part of getting his license to sell used cars, and that was how they started to track him down.
Oh, right. So that was gonna be my next question. Yeah, if he was living an uneventful life, how did they find him? So you said they by that fingerprint with the no tip off, no undercover informant to move that along.
There was a person who was overheard in a bar by Stockton Buck, who was an FBI agent working in the Bay Area at the time. And Stockton Buck learned that there were Mays escapees living in the San Francisco area. They got their hands on the fingerprints, and they figured out pretty quickly that there were four. There was Kevin Barry Artt, there was Jimmy Smith, who was then living under the name of James Lynch, Terry Kirby, and Paul Brennan. They moved first against Smith and Artt. They figured out that Kevin Barry Artt had pulled a passport in the name of Kevin Cohane. And so when they arrested him that day in San Diego on June 3rd, 1992, the initial charge on which he was held was making a false statement to obtain a passport. They had the extradition warrant, but it hadn't yet been unsealed. Jimmy Smith was arrested the same day, and then Terry Kirby and Paul Brennan, the other two, were arrested pretty soon after that.
Okay, we're talking to attorney and author Dan Lawton about his book, Above the Ground, A True Story of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Once again, you get a hold of Dan on Twitter at Dan Lawton Writer. The book's available at Wild Blue Press, of course, and Amazon. We'll have a link in the description. If you want to meet Dan in person, got any legal questions for him, right? He seems to be a very good lawyer. Warwick's in La Jolla, California. They're September 7th, 7 p.m., and before that, they're having a little tribute there at Hennessy's to launch the event there. So now, these arrests with the FBI, were they uneventful? Any kind of resistance? Any kind of problems?
He didn't resist. That morning, he was asleep on his houseboat, which is where he was living on Mission Bay. And the harbor master came and knocked on the side of the boat, and the ruse was that there had been a break-in of cars in the parking lot. And, Kevin, it looks like maybe your car was broken into. Why don't you come out? So he came rushing out, and they descended on him at that time. There were maybe a dozen agents there. They transported him downtown to the MCC, which is our federal jail in downtown San Diego. I think they had one in New York also by that same name.
Yeah.
And he was put in a cell that was designed for the worst of the worst prisoners. Kevin later remembered that it seemed like it was a cell designed for Hannibal Lecter. It had stainless steel. It was all stainless steel walls. And when I met him, which was a few days after that, he had a 3-man hold on him, and was hobbled and with a waist chain and handcuffs and all of it. So they viewed him as, a convicted murderer, a member of the IRA, a prison escaper, and the means they took to make sure that he was secured were very severe.
Yeah, and objective, you look at his classification, the guy is an escape from the Maze prison. The guy was an IRA, IRA murderer. Of course, a week earlier, he was selling you a used car. No one was worried about him then. But, when you come in there with that kind of paperwork, you can't blame him too much. You know what I'm saying? You're right.
Yeah. You're right, Ed. I mean, prison guards, police officers, they're like the rest of us. I mean, they want to be safe in their doing of their job, and and not take chances.
And also, it's like a checklist too. Like when you go to McDonald's, he's got every kind of, gang affiliation, terrorist affiliation, murder charge, escape. He's got a little checklist there. But now, an MCC too is a horrific, and the one in New York is horrific. I've never been to the one in California, but I can only imagine. So then, what happens then? He's sitting in there. How old is he when they pick him up the second time in the MCC?
Well, let's see. It was 1992. So let's see. So 33 years of age by that time.
33 years of age. Still a young man. Was he married, kids, or anything like that?
He'd been married in Northern Ireland to Carmen Artt, who was the mother of his son, Barry Paul. They both still lived there, but he hadn't had any contact with them, in a number of years for reasons that you could guess. He was the most wanted fugitive the British had, and so he wasn't in contact with them. He had a girlfriend down here by the name of Cara Jansen, and he'd had a daughter with her. And his parents, of course, still lived in Belfast. He had a brother and sister who still lived in Northern Ireland, and, of course, his birth parents. But he hadn't been in contact with any of them for a number of years, and one of the memories I have of that time being 1992, was being able to patch him through on the telephone from the jail to his mom and dad, and to Carmen, so that they could talk for the first time since 1983.
Wow, what a life, man! What a life! This kid really never had a break, man. So now he's sitting here in California. And he's not just facing, has to go back on these murder charges. Now he's got escape charges, all kind of fun stuff, right? So what happens, because there is a happy ending to the story. He's been cleared of these charges. But what happens next then? Do they fight extradition? What happens?
Yeah, the British wanted him extradited and wanted him right back in the Maze. That's where they thought he belonged. And, of course, he had a great fear of that for the reason that you mentioned earlier. He was convicted of murdering a prison official, the deputy governor of the prison, who was well loved by the guards who worked there. And he'd had assassination attempts when he lived in Belfast, 3 of them. He narrowly survived all 3 of them. So he had a lot of fear about getting sent back for those reasons. The U.S. attorney wanted to have the case tried in San Francisco. And so he was pretty quickly moved up to San Francisco, and his big problem was he needed a lawyer and a law firm that had the resources to fight the Goliaths of not only the U.S. Attorney's Office, but the British government, who the U.S. Attorney's Office was basically acting as, their attorney in this proceeding. And that wasn't going to be just any lawyer or law firm. That had to be somebody really good and someone who had the financial resources to be able to do investigation, to travel to Northern Ireland, to interview witnesses, to collect reams of documents, all of that. And so that was Jim Brosnahan of Morrison and Forster, a great trial lawyer, maybe the greatest of his generation. He's still around. He's 85 years old. And he was acquainted with me, or I was acquainted with him, and I called him several times, and finally I got him in a hotel room up in Sacramento one night where he was sleeping. It was about 10:30 p.m. He had to give a closing argument in a jury trial the next day, and I said, look, I'm Dan Lawton. You probably don't remember me, but there's this Irish guy. He's on the run from the British. He's convicted of a murder. He escaped. I think he might be innocent, and I think you'd be the perfect lawyer to represent him. He doesn't have any money, so it would be a pro bono engagement. I realize this is a lot to throw at you at 10:30, on on a Sunday night. And God bless him, Jim Brosnahan and his team at Morrison & Forster took on the case of Kevin Barry Artt, and they fought it for 8 years in the federal courts here in California.
I would love to hear that phone call. Hey, buddy, I got a free case for you. Guy's been convicted.
Yeah.
Murder charges. He killed a cop. Okay, but how did you come in? Dan Lawton. How did Dan Lawton hear about this guy, Kevin Barry Artt, that you thought he was innocent?
Well, it was big news here locally in San Diego. It's not every day, in our sleepy little Navy town, or what was then a sleepy little Navy town, that someone who's a wanted murderer and terrorist, gets busted by the FBI. They publicized their own arrest, of course. He got a public defender appointed right away, and that lawyer called me because he knew that the law firm that I then worked for, Loose Forward, did asylum applications for refugees. Right. And he said, why don't you go over to the MCC and talk to him? It looks like I'm going to be getting off his case because they're going to move him to San Francisco. So I went over there, and I spent about an hour with him, and I heard him out. He told me his real name right away, didn't make any, didn't try to, BS me or anything. And I said, how did you get convicted of this murder? And he said, I confessed. Oh. And as an American, I had the sort of American idea that people don't confess to things unless they did them. And then he said, and I didn't do it. He told me his story. It seemed fantastical, and by that I mean, improbable, implausible. And if you stay a lawyer long enough, maybe like if you stay a private investigator long enough, you hear a lot of stories that people tell, and sometimes they check out and sometimes they don't. But as time passed, all of the fantastical elements of what he told me in that visiting room at the MCC turned out to be documentable and true. And so that's how it started to happen. Yeah.
Lawton, yeah. But now what caused him to confess? Was he beaten?
Well, the British system at that time, when it came to going after the IRA, was very heavily dependent on confessions. And under the emergency laws, there was no right to have a lawyer present, and there was torture. I think he would say he wasn't physically tortured. He was beaten when he was in Castlereagh Interrogation Center, which is, was a notorious place, a confession factory that the RUC mined for many confessions. And the simple coercion of a confession from a suspect in police custody, as we now know from cases like the Central Park Five, and the case of Mohammed Salahi, who was incarcerated at Guantanamo for all those years and confessed to all kinds of things that he never did, is not rocket science. Those detectives, they knew how to get confessions. They knew how to threaten you with the loss of your family. They knew how to falsely promise that, don't worry, we're going to stand up in court for you and make sure you get a greatly reduced sentence if you'll just play ball with us. They knew how to deprive you of a sense of what time it was. They knew how to deprive you of sleep, and to make you feel extremely desperate. And so he eventually broke down and confessed, as a great number of other people did.
Yeah, just think they're doing it 7 days a week, and this is your first time you're arrested, first time you're in contact with this kind of situation. You don't know. And those poor kids, I lived in New York for the Central Park Five, and they had just started videotaping confessions, like, a couple of months before that case. These were the first time we saw videotaped confessions on TV. And they showed us these little clips, and everyone said, oh, yeah, they look guilty as hell, and all these years later you find out. Couple of questions for you now. What is the procedure now? Because I'm trying to understand, he's been convicted, he's escaped. How did we get to the point where now we're trying to get a new trial to prove his innocence? Like, wouldn't there just be, you can fight for extradition, maybe fight the escape charges, but how do you get a whole new trial going?
Well, Ed, under the amended extradition treaty, that came into effect in 1986, there was a clause in it called Article 3A. And Article 3A was written into the treaty at the behest of none other than the man who's currently our president, Joe Biden of Delaware, who's an Irish American, and with the help of some other Irish American senators, said, wait a minute, we're taking the political offense exception out. And so there are Irish Republicans who are sought for extradition in the States, and not all of them are terrorists, and they shouldn't just be extradited based on, okay, here's a conviction, we've ID'd you as the same person who's convicted, back you go. There should be some way, if there was an unfair trial, or if this person is being sought to discriminate against them or to persecute them for their religion or their political opinion, for them to persuade a U.S. district judge of that, and they can avoid extradition. That was Article 3A. But there had never been a trial about what Article 3A really meant before. It was the first trial that ever was had, where these cases were the first time that treaty language was ever tested in court, what it really meant. Nobody knew what it really meant. Joe Biden probably knew what he had in mind, but the nuts and bolts of it in a courtroom. So the trial that was had in San Francisco involved whether the charges against Kevin Barry Artt, in the first place, the murder charge, had been trumped up, whether he had a fair or an unfair trial. Of course, the trial he had was very unfair, and whether he should, on that basis, be able to resist extradition. And that trial was had. He lost that trial, but in the Ninth Circuit, he won his appeal, and the case was sent back down. And before there could be another trial, the Good Friday Agreement came about in 1998, and that was the agreement that ended the Troubles. And one of its provisions said that anyone who was in the Mays prison, no matter how bad it was, what they had done or been convicted of doing, they would walk free. And so at some point, the U.S. government, which was continuing to insist that he be extradited, notwithstanding this clause, was asked by the Ninth Circuit to show cause why the case just shouldn't be dropped, because what was the point of extraditing him just to have him walk on the same day? And the British government saw the writing on the wall. Peter Mandelson, who was their foreign secretary, wrote the message to the U.S. State Department formally notifying the U.S. government that the British were dropping the case at last. So the case sort of ended with a whimper in 2000, but that was 8 years after it had started. So it really was, Ed, a marathon.
I was going to ask you about this Article 3A. You took the question right out of my mouth. So this wasn't commonly known or wasn't previously used. Who on this whole team of Morrison, Forrester, and Daniel, who discovered that?
Well, Jim Brosnahan is just a brilliant lawyer, and he didn't do it by himself. He had a great team of colleagues. He had Jennifer Small, who's now passed away, who was a brilliant young lawyer, George Harris, and Dan Vandermoortel, who was a paralegal but did an incredible amount of work on the case over 8 years, and worked very closely with the attorneys. And they researched this thing, just about to death, and they knew more about Article 3A and extradition and the diplomat court system than any other set of American lawyers that probably ever practiced law by the end of it.
Did they use this? Did other clients come to them after this and say, hey, we got the same situation?
No, because this was a pretty unique situation. But no, it's a great question, Ed, because the answer includes this too. There was another Mays escapee, Jimmy Smith, and he was in the same, not the same situation in that he was innocent. I don't believe Jimmy Smith was innocent. But he had a public defender named Karen Snell, who was very talented, who, by coincidence, was a former Brosnahan protege from Morrison and Forrester before she went with the PD's office. And she defended Jimmy Smith, who won his extradition trial, succeeded under Article 3A, and then had the Ninth Circuit take it away. And he did get extradited, and he did wind up back in the Mays.
For how long?
I believe until the Good Friday Agreement came about, which was 98. So that would be, I think, the better part of 3 years.
And our friend there, Barry Artt, he was in custody in the United States for 8 years?
He wasn't in custody that whole time.
Really?
He came out on bail in January 1996, and I remember it well because, of course, the British government and the U.S. Attorney were aghast that, we were seeking to have Barry Artt come out on bail. They said, reminiscent of what you mentioned earlier, wait a minute. He murdered Albert Miles, or is convicted of doing it. He escaped from the Maze prison. You want to let him out on bail? No, I don't think so. Sounds like a flight risk, sounds like a danger to the community. But with the help of some supporters, we put together a bond package, got the court in San Diego to approve those folks as sureties, and Judge Legg in San Francisco decided he's coming out. There's a bond posted. There's a legal guardian. He has to live with her. She's made certain promises that she's going to, he can't leave except to go to the doctor or go to church, all of this. And he came out on a late morning in January 1996 at Golden Gate Avenue in San Francisco. And the party that night at his apartment went on until 6 o'clock the next morning. It was just a really happy occasion. And just about 4 years had passed while he sat in jail waiting for this momentous event.
Well, part 2 of that party will be at Hennessy's 6 p.m. on September 7th.
It'll probably be a little less rowdy.
I don't know, man.
It'll be a happy occasion.
Will Barry Artt be there?
He won't be there. I really wish he was going to be there, but he won't be there on that occasion. But my hope is that we're going to have other events, and because I think, he's a hell of a lot more interesting than I am. He's the guy that actually lived all of this and came out the other end alive and well, and so many people did not come out the other end.
So true. And that whole situation was horrific to begin with. And we watched it on the news here every night in the United States. Plus, my grandmother's Irish. Now, my question is, what was it about Barry Artt that he was able to so much support? How did he get all this support from all these different forces, these big law firms? What was it? The bail? What was it?
Well, I think part of it, Ed, is the Irish and Irish American communities have very strong feelings about people, the Irish Republican person who is badly treated by the policing and legal systems in Northern Ireland and the British government. There are people that grow up with it, especially, in the area where you're from originally. There's an awful lot of Irish American folks there and Irish people. In San Francisco, there's a tremendous, maybe 30,000 Irish living in San Francisco, maybe more. And a lot of those people instinctively and reflexively wanted to help him. Jim Brosnahan, his brilliant lawyer who worked this extradition case for free for 8 years at MoFo, he's Irish American, and he grew up with all of that. And as a lawyer who did criminal defense work in addition to civil work, any criminal defense lawyer, I think, if they're being honest with you, will tell you the number of truly innocent clients they've had in a career maybe is one or two, if that many. And here was a chance to represent a guy that was innocent, who was fighting persecution by the British government, and to present in a public forum the mistreatment of him. To Jim Brosnahan, I think that must have been kind of a dream gig, and he sure hit it out of the park.
So then what has Artt been doing since 96 till 2024?
Well, he's married. He married an Irish girl who's a naturalized U.S. citizen. They have two teenage kids together. One of them is now a freshman in college. He has a successful contracting business called Art and Alchemy in San Francisco. So they do remodeling and painting. He owns 2 homes in San Francisco. One of them he rents out, the other one he lives in. And he's, you're probably too young to remember Leave It to Beaver, but there was a character on that TV sitcom who was the dad the American
Ward.
TV sitcom Dad. Ward Cleaver, that's right.
Of course I remember.
Very good. Okay. Well, somebody told you about that. You did not see it in its original run. But he has become kind of that guy. He's
Ward Cleaver.
He's an American dad. He's just very dutiful. He's a wonderful dad, and he's a peaceful person and law-abiding, and he's living the California dream, I would say.
Yeah, I was born in '62, so I actually watched Leave It to Beaver. I was the same age as the Beaver when I was watching the show. Okay, so yeah, they used to call me the Beaver. No, I just remember that just then. My parents used to call me the Beaver. But how incredible is this? This guy, man, went to hell and back. The Maze prison, and here he is with his own business, art and alchemy. What a story, man! Rags to riches. Does he do interviews?
He doesn't really do interviews. I wish that he did, and I would invite you to call him and invite him on your show. I think it could be really good listening. Now, I'm not vouching at all for whether he would do it or not. He likes keeping a low profile, and I have to tell you, from time to time, Ed, he had real reservations about this book coming out. His fear that somebody in Northern Ireland would read this and be offended at how they were portrayed. His fear that somebody in the U.S. government would read it and remember, oh yeah, this is the guy that stuck a thumb in our eye, in the federal courts for 8 years. Let's see what we can do to maybe kick him out of the country or something. And we had several conversations about it, and I won't inflict all that on you, but he really wants to live a low-profile life for reasons that I'm sure you could understand. Yeah.
No, I get it. And it's funny, too, because my next question was going to be, what's his reaction to the book? It's almost as if you're looking over my shoulder, my notes, okay, Mr. Lawton? Okay. But you mentioned earlier, okay, that there were 3 assassination attempts on his life. Can you describe those?
Sure. The first one, he was living in Belfast. It was 1979. He was driving a cab for Ace Taxi, which was an unlicensed taxi service that catered to a Catholic clientele that otherwise wouldn't be able to get rides from A to B in Belfast. And he was living in an area of Belfast called the Murder Triangle, which had a lot of paramilitary violence, a lot of doorstep shootings and so forth. He got home at the end of his shift. Maybe it was about 6 p.m., it was November of 1979, and he went upstairs. I think he had a 3rd-floor apartment in a house that had been modified to had parts of it that were rented out to tenants. And the owners were a young married couple named Peter and Ann Heathwood. And there was a knock at the door. Kevin was upstairs in the bathroom, I think, and then he heard the sound of the door getting kicked in, a scream of Ann Heathwood, who had answered the door. 2 gunmen came in, and they shot Peter Heathwood, who was there with his young daughter, who I think was 3 at the time, and they ran off. Kevin ran downstairs to find Peter Heathwood, his landlord, laying there on the floor. They called an ambulance. The police arrived, and when they arrived, Kevin observed their body language, and they walked in as though they were very nonchalant, like, there's nothing to see here. They sort of ambled into the room, and then when they looked down at the stricken man bleeding from gunshot wounds on the floor, their eyes got big, and one of them said to no one in particular, "You shot the wrong man. Art lives upstairs."
Whoa.
And then he realized this had been meant for him. They had just shot the wrong guy by mistake. Peter Heathwood was paralyzed. His spine was severed by one of those bullets. He survived, and he is still alive today. He lives in a small coastal town in Northern Ireland, and I visited with him in 2019, interviewed him, and spent some time with him. And the British government... and he wound up in a lawsuit because it was his theory that the men who shot him were in collusion with people in the RUC, the police force that is, who knew where Kevin Barry Artt lived. and they were the ones that were legally responsible for this shooting. And shortly before the case would have gone to trial, the British settled with Peter Heathwood, paid him a large sum of money, I think maybe the largest sum of money that's ever been paid in a Troubles-related incident like this to a victim. And to this day, they've never admitted, after paying that big chunk of change, who was it that did the shooting and who ordered the shooting. And Peter summed it up for me in one sentence. He said, "Nobody learns the truth about their dirty war."
Mm. It's so true, yeah. And what a situation that whole thing was, man. What a mess. And like you said before, the size of Connecticut, and everyone was affected. And forget, what a nightmare. Now we're just about out of time. We've been talking to Dan Lawton. The name of the book is Above the Ground. The website is abovethegroundbook.com. The book is Above the Ground: A True Story of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Once again, you can find Dan Lawton, writer, on Twitter. The book, there's a website on Wild Blue Press that describes the book. You can meet it in person at Warwick's in La Jolla, September 7th, 7 p.m., also Hennessy's. Now, Dan, are there any questions I haven't asked you about this story that you think the audience should know about?
I don't think so, Ed. I think, you've obviously prepared really thoroughly for this and done your homework. I think we've covered the waterfront. And
yeah.
If I would add one thing, I would say I hope that some people will feel that there is a timeless aspect to this story that doesn't just apply to Northern Ireland, but in the United States, we've experienced the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and then we saw what happened after that when it came to changes to civil liberties being curtailed, and the so-called war on terror. And it produced, some good effects. We haven't had another attack like that, of course, as people like Dick Cheney would be quick to point out. But it also produced some terrible abuses of individual rights. People like Mohammed Salahi, Guantanamo Bay. There's still men at Guantanamo Bay. They've been there for years. They've never been charged with anything. And when will they ever go home? Every once in a while they release a new one. And so I think one of the timeless dimensions of this story is the lengths that governments will go to when they perceive that there's a national emergency, and the abuses that can happen without people like Jim Brosnahan, without people like Barry Artt that are willing to say, look, I'm not laying down for this. It would be easy for me to just throw in the towel and submit to what you want. I'm not doing it. I'm going to go to court and assert my rights because this isn't correct. And I'm glad that he did.
Yeah, just think, right around that same time in New York, Matula Shakur, acupuncturist, trying to get people off of drugs, was arrested, caught up in that Brinks job thing where they claimed he was going to somehow get some money after the robbery. Right around the same time, spent all this time in prison up until just recently they let him out, only to pass away to his many diseases and illnesses. Dan Lawton, what are you working on next? You've got the writing bug now. What's next?
Well, I am practicing law full time. At the present time, I took a sabbatical from law practice in order to research and write the book. It took me 16 months of full time to do that, and as you might imagine, at the end of that period, was running out of money, so I had to go back to my day job, which I'm very happy doing. I'm very lucky to be with a great law firm, Kleinditz, in San Diego, but I do have some more books in me, I feel, and I think the next one will be a novel. It won't have anything to do with politics or Northern Ireland or anything like that, but I've got a pretty specific idea for it, and we'll see.
Thank you so much. Hey, give me a call when the next book comes out. Dan Lawton, abovethegroundbook.com. The book is called Above the Ground: A True Story of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. You can find Dan on Twitter, Dan Lawton, writer. Wild Blue Press is publishing the book. They helped arrange the interview. You want to meet him in person? Is this like a book signing in Warwick's?
Yeah, we're going to have some boards up, photographs and maps on boards, so people can browse around and look at some images, and then we're going to have remarks, maybe a couple of short readings, Q&A, and then if people want books signed, of course, we'll do that. And then we'll be over at Hennessy's, and as you said, that'll be part 2 of the party that started in 1996.
There you go, man. There you go. Well, have one for me, okay, my friend?
I sure will, Ed. I wish you were going to be there. I want to thank your audience for listening, and I want to thank you for having a great podcast and giving the gift of it to the world.
No, yeah, thank you. Great story, man. Barry Artt, man. God bless him, man. He's doing art and gallery, art and alchemy over there.
Art and alchemy, that's right.
Art and alchemy in San Francisco. Thank you so much, my friend. Good night.
You're welcome. Thanks, Ed. Bye.